Riddle me this, and don't overthink it. If your character regenerates energy for your allies and increases their attack stat, would this character belong to the Harmony path, aka the buffing class, or Abundance path, aka the healing class? Pick unrelated. Anyway, the path is Abundance, aka healing, and the character is Huohuo. Concerning the support classes, it feels as if characters dip their toes into the waters of paths outside their own quite often. And it's to the point that even when I hear that a new character will be Abundance or Harmony, I have to ask myself to what degree. Because characters do a lot more than exactly what it says on the tin. In fact, their worth is often decided not by what's written on the tin, but by all the extra little things they do. Abundance characters often just feel like Harmony characters that can heal. Some Nihility characters leave the supportive branch altogether and move into DPS territory. Why do Sustainer and Combative supports go outside of their path so much in this game? Is it Hoyoverse just being silly with their own labels? And either way, does it matter? I'm going to attempt to answer some of these questions and maybe a few more as I delve into some of the reasons I believe support in Star Rail is just one big path. To start, I'm going to talk about the Sustainer classes, Abundance and Preservation. Honestly, Abundance and Preservation characters usually just feel like Harmony or Nihility characters that can heal or shield. I swear, Huohuo, Lingsha, Aventurine, these guys are doing much more than just keeping your team alive. I mean, Huohuo is an Abundance character, and heal she does, but her ultimate is straight up out of the Book of Harmony. It regenerates energy for all allies and increases their attack. That's nothing to do with healing. And how about Lingsha? There's a healing mechanic in her ultimate, sure, but a huge part of her entire appeal is the fact that her ultimate inflicts Befog on all enemies, which increases the break damage that enemies receive. That also sounds like it could be something out of the Book of Harmony or Nihility. And there's a reason I said Harmony or Nihility there, but I'll come back to that point later on. What about preservation characters like our boy Aventurine? What does his ultimate do? Applies Unnerved to the enemy target, increasing the crit damage dealt for 3 turns. Yeah, right out of the Harmony and Nihility books once again. The effects I just went over have nothing to do with sustaining. At all. But why would so many sustains have these combative mechanics in their kits? Why not just heal, or shield, or mitigate? There's a few explanations for why sustains don't just stay in their lane and keep your team alive, but I think a lot of it comes down to there just not being enough healing or shielding to do. Meaning that if that's all every sustain character did, it would result in wholly uninteresting characters with too much overlap. If every character just healed, if every character just shielded, then you would never want or need another one except based on the amount of raw healing and shielding performed. Remember Natasha? We all got a Natasha. Her entire kit is just healing with a pinch of debuff removal. If every Abundance character after her also only healed, then you wouldn't need an upgrade from Natasha. Unless, over the game's lifespan, enemies began to hit so hard that you just needed stronger healing. But that would be an uninteresting way to assess your roster, would it not? Reduced to simply, is Natasha healing enough for the game right now? If yes, no need for the new healer. If no, then pull for the newest healer. Yeah, that wouldn't fly. It's subjective, sure, but I believe most players would find that both reductive and boring. Sustainers need something outside of just sustaining to be attractive pickups. Abundance and preservation characters encroaching upon the roles of other paths may seem like an overstepping of boundaries at first, but the alternative would be Abundance and preservation characters only having each other to encroach upon. Again, that's just not interesting. But still, the question remains, why would sustainers be so narrowly pathed in a hypothetical world where all they do is sustain? After all, when looking at the DPS classes, single target hunt, multi-target or AoE erudition, and tanky, weird, strange, happy, medium destruction, whatever that's supposed to be. They rarely, if ever, operate outside the boundaries of their class's designation. You don't see hunt characters with team heals or cheating by doing AoE. You don't see erudition characters shielding allies or cheating by doing massive single target bursts. So why do sustains get to cheat? The reason for this is simply the number of DPS parameters versus the number of sustain parameters. That is to say, several in the case of DPS characters versus basically just one in the case of sustainers. Let's analyze just how many parameters there are when considering a DPS character. You first of all have the main three types, Hunt, Erudition, and Destruction, but beyond that you have 7 damage types, Imaginary, Physical, Fire, Ice, Lightning, Wind, and Quantum. The 3 paths paired with any element already produces 21 unique character combos. But then you have the mode of attack. Classical hyper carry damage dealers, general follow-up attackers, counter-attack follow-up attackers, summons follow-up attackers, damage over time based, break and super break based. You can see where I'm going with this. Different paths, elements, and modes of attack give us a variety of possible DPS combinations to look out for. And that's still not the end of it. There are still other parameters such as scaling types with attack, effect hit rate, break effect, crit damage, crit rate, and all those that can be used to further differentiate DPS damage deliveries from one another, leaving plenty of room for others to step into an unfilled spot. In contrast, how many character parameters can we point out for sustains? DPS characters dish out damage, and there's various combinations to do that, as well as various enemy weaknesses. But sustains? Healing or shielding deals with one parameter, the player's HP. That's all. It's not like there's multiple kinds of player HP, in contrast to multiple kinds of enemy weaknesses, mob sizes, and types for DPS characters to take on. No, the one survival stat in the game for all playable characters is just HP. As a result, a heal or shield is universal to the point that if healers and shielders only healed and shielded and nothing else, every sustain would be extremely redundant. One single parameter, your HP, isn't enough to make a whole class of characters on. For sustained characters to only sustain and nothing else, HP itself would have to diversify, or the way enemies apply damage or something. For example, 2 different life bars. A regular life bar for physical, quantum, and imaginary attacks against the player, and an elemental life bar for ice, fire, wind, and lightning attacks. With something like this, suddenly you've created scenarios for 2 different kinds of sustains to specialize in. A regular healer or shielder, and an elemental one. Not that I'm offering this as an actual idea, to be clear, I'm just giving an example. This would be a mess for several reasons that I won't get into, but it's the point I'm outlining that's important. HP is just HP, and restoring it or protecting it is alone not enough to justify an entire character. Sustains must offer more than that. Lingsha and Huohuo both restore HP. Great. But if they didn't step outside of their abundance lane, then what would be the point in both of them? Again, it's not like there's different kinds of HP or something to restore, so they dabble into other paths to give themselves some differentiation. Lingsha works great with break teams, is great against fire weaknesses, and is almost a mini erudition unit all on her own. And Huohuo is good at regenerating energy and boosting the attack stat. Aventurine works well with follow-up teams, and his ultimate is best suited for party members who crit, making him a little less suitable for super break and dot teams which don't crit. All said, Abundance and Preservation characters may be Harmony Light or Nihility Light characters with sustaining capabilities, sure, but any other way and they would all kind of be the same character. A roster of Natashas. Next, I'm going to talk about the combative supports, Harmony and Nihility. According to the game itself, what are the core functions of these roles? Well, let's check it out. Harmony applies buffs to allies to improve the team's combat capacities. Okay, what about Nihility? Applies debuffs to enemies to reduce their combat capacities. Alright, okay, so TLDR, Harmony units grant power to allies, and Nihility units zap power from enemies. Got it, cool. Now, for the most part, these descriptions seem fine, but I've noticed a few things about these two roles, and I have to say Hoyoverse can be pretty tricky with their technicalities. But let me step back. You know how I said abundance and preservation characters are more like lightweight Harmony and lightweight Nihility characters with sustain? Well, the thing about Harmony and Nihility units I've noticed is that often they masquerade as each other. I know that might sound cap at first until you really read the definitions and compare it to what the characters do. But what good is me just talking, right? We need examples. Well, alright, let's look at Miss Quintessential Harmony, Ranmei. Her talent unconditionally increases all her ally speed, and she does coordinated damage when enemies are weakness broken. Okay, that's cool. Her skill increases all ally damage and break efficiency. Alright. And her ultimate gives all allies resistance penetration and their attacks apply Thanatal Plum Rebloom. Okay, so what's Thanatal Plum Rebloom? When these enemies attempt to recover from weakness break, Thanatal Plum Rebloom is triggered, extending the duration of their weakness break, delaying their action by an amount equal to 20% of Ranmei's break effect plus 10%. And blah 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 blah, we can forget the rest. Let's focus on that right there. Thanatal Plum Rebloom extends the duration of their weakness break and delays their action by a percentage of Ranmei's break effect. That's a debuff. That's Nihility, not Harmony. But hey, don't take my word for it. All you gotta do is look at the status summary page of an enemy with Thanatal Plum Rebloom, and you'll see it's listed right there under debuffs. Now look, I'm not saying Ranmei isn't a Harmony character. 2/3 of her kit is, maybe even 3/4. The universal speed, the coordinated damage, increased ally damage, and break. Yeah, she's broken. Get it? But that enemy action delay mechanic from her ultimate is a pretty novel part of her identity. Again, I'm not saying, oh wow, this is a debuff, she should be a Nihility character. No. But it is a debuff all the same. Maybe it could have been the basis for an actual Nihility character, you know what I mean? After all, Welt is an actual Nihility unit and he can manipulate enemy speeds and delay their turns with his ultimate. But Ranmei, a Harmony unit, can do the same? See what I mean? Yeah, it's kinda weird. The question is though, did they break a rule with this? Well, what does it say about Harmony units again? Applies buffs to allies to improve the team's combat capacities. Is that what Ranmei did? Well, yeah, really. You see, the technicality here is that Ranmei doesn't apply the debuff to the enemies. When she uses her ultimate, she empowers her allies with the ability to implant the debuff when they attack. She buffed them with a transferable debuff. And that's what I mean by sneaky masquerade. This could have been a good effect on an actual Nihility character's ultimate. Instead of granting the debuff transfer to allies, the Nihility character would instead plant marks on all the enemies, and if allies attacked marked weakness broken enemies, it activates the delay debuff. Pretty much the same thing, just a different methodology. In fact, we have converse examples showing that exact concept. Enter one Jiaoqiu, Mr. Nihility. It's not a one-way street, it's not just Harmony characters masquerading debuffs as buffs. Nihility characters masquerade buffs as debuffs as well, but it's so subtle that you'd almost not notice it. Let's look at his ultimate, the part about the zone. Activates a zone and deals fire damage equal to a percent of Jiaoqiu's attack to all enemies. Fair. While inside the zone, enemy targets receive increased ultimate damage. And blah blah blah, okay, that's enough. It's easy to say enemy targets receive increased ultimate damage, and call that a debuff. But let's be real here, that is less so a debuff and more so an ally buff. This is a harmony effect simply made into a debuff through perspective. If you grant allies the ability to do 20% more ultimate damage, you've buffed them, aka harmony. If you give enemies a status in which they take 20% more ultimate damage, you've debuffed them, aka nihility. See how that works? You can cleverly make most buffs into debuffs and vice versa by simply changing the way stats and statuses change or are applied. It's no different for his talent with the Ash and Roast stacks. When he hits an enemy with basic attack, skill, or ultimate, there's a 100% base chance to inflict Ash and Roast. At one stack, Ash and Roast increases damage received by the enemy by a percentage, then each subsequent stack up to 5 stacks by a smaller percentage. Like, yes, Ash and Roast is a debuff. It's a status that the enemy holds, I get it. But its function is to increase the damage you do. Functionally speaking, his purpose is the same as any classic Harmony character, from his talent with the Ash and Roast mechanic to his ultimate. He low-key functions as a Harmony unit, and it kind of shows as well in players' initial perceptions. Which is to say, not as a character whose purpose is to NP the enemy by slowing them down or nerfing their attacks or whatever like that, but rather a character to make your other characters hit harder. You can say it however you want, but if Jiaoqiu's ultimate makes your characters do more damage, there's an argument to be made that it could just as well be considered to be pseudo-harmony, a buff, because the team's combat capacities have been improved. Saying enemies receive more damage instead is just a way of changing their perspective. It's kind of like switching from active to passive voice. Similar to how whether you say, the boy threw the ball, or the ball was thrown by the boy is the one doing the throwing even though the active voice changed to passive. And similarly, with Ranmei's The Nental Plum Rebloom, sure you can say all day that an ally was buffed with a debuff implant, but just because the delivery is through an ally buff, that doesn't mean the ability isn't ripping from the Book of Nihility. The end result is that a debuff is put on an enemy, the enemy's action is delayed, whatever mental gymnastics one may want to say to justify it as otherwise. Often, these just seem to be two sides of the same coin. Even when they're acting within the bounds of their path, it can result in that. I mean, Pela is Nihility and can reduce enemy defenses, which is textbook debuff. It's on brand. But even the point of that is so that you do more damage, aka improve your team's combat capacity, aka a pseudo buff. And you know, it's really telling when replacements of either Harmony or Nihility characters can come in the form of characters from the other path. Case in point, what we're due to receive soon. Now, I won't go into huge spoilery details, but Harmony main character has been the Super Break support since Harmony main character came out. But soon we'll be receiving 5-star Ting Yun, Fugue, who will probably replace Harmony main character. The thing is, Fugue is Nihility, and Harmony main character is exactly what it says on the tin. A Nihility character that can replace a Harmony one? I think that's saying enough. There's another side to all this though, and this is talking about Nihility in particular. While Nihility characters often do this pseudo-masking thing going on with Harmony and vice versa sometimes, it also just has this crazy DPS thing too. Like damage over time is a debuff, and there are units who were specifically made to be DPS units through damage over time. So with these DOT units, we're not even talking about traditional debuffing anymore. We're just straight up scrapping with the enemy at this point. Some interchangeability with Harmony sometimes is one thing, but this is a whole different level of stepping out of the supportive bounds. Nihility says applies debuffs to enemies to reduce their combat capacities. I'm thinking reduces their speed, or reduces their attack, or makes them miss a turn or something. I mean, okay, sure, dots are debuffs, but they reduce enemy combat capacities? I mean, I guess so if you freaking kill the enemy. That's the best debuff in the game. I guess it's not wrong. which is to say nothing of Acheron, the most nihility of nihility characters in the game. Queen Nihility gains points to her ultimate through debuffs, but she herself is all about big funny damage number, and not even heavily dot related like Kafka or Black Swan, just straight up big funny damage number for no reason. When she came out, she outclassed every character that was in the actual DPS classes of Hunt, Erudition, or Destruction, and she's still one of the bests. So, in wrapping this up, Star Rail characters have an identity problem when it comes to their paths, particularly the supportive paths. The funniest part is when characters of these paths mix it up so much that they start incorporating the mix-up of the other paths they're imitating. Remember earlier when I said I was going to come back to this? And how about Linksha? There's a healing mechanic in her ultimate, sure, but a huge part of her entire appeal is the fact that her ultimate inflicts Befog on all enemies, which increases the break damage that enemies receive. That also sounds like it could be something out of the book of Harmony or Nihility. And there's a reason I said Harmony or Nihility there, but I'll come back to that point later on. The reason I said Harmony and Nihility is because honestly, this is doing the interchangeability thing. Linksha, an Abundance character, inflicts Befog on all enemies. A debuff. Okay, which increases the break damage that enemies receive. Oh, so an ally buff masked as a debuff. See what I'm saying? This is next level. It's a healer crossing over into buff through a pseudo debuff. And the same with Aventurine. His ultimate applies the unnerved debuff to the enemy target, increasing the crit damage dealt to them. Dude, these examples are the ultimate of all blurred lines. Sustained characters buffing ally capacities through debuffs. It's completely full circle. But in the end, does it matter? Not really. Especially if you step back from specific labels and reduce all these characters to their top level label, support. You see, if you just think about all these characters as supports, be they healer, shielder, buffer, or debuffer, then it's easier to accept the increasingly blurred lines. Don't think of them as harmony units or preservation units, just label them all support and it becomes this grander stage for characters to breathe alongside one another. This character is super good at healing, while that character is mid at healing but can weaken the enemy's attacks. This character is all buffs and debuffs with no healing capabilities, while that one is a shielder who buffs. If you strip away the path name, label them all support, and only judge them based on what they actually offer, they no longer seem to step all over one another, nor step out of their lanes. They all just become characters with specific perks. Maybe it's the path labeling itself that has us stuffing characters into a box, but if you just stand back and pretend the labels don't exist, you can then just value a character completely for what they individually offer. Personal case in point, when Huohuo was on her recent rerun. I already had Lynx, I had Aventurine, and knew Linksha was going to be coming soon as well, so I had sustainers lined up. But I was still on the verge of getting Huohuo. Why? Because she does do their energy regeneration thing and she straight buffs attack. Both traits which I found to be potentially desirable for playing with my Kafka and Black Swan. And yeah, in the end I did get her, and I've no regrets yet. She was a huge pickup for me, and Aventurine and Linksha still have their own uses as well. If I was just looking at Huohuo's abundance label, I might have been focusing on the wrong thing. Her label became meaningless, it all came down to what she does outside of healing. And maybe that should be the takeaway here. Maybe the takeaway here shouldn't be that the paths are these preordained rules that the developers break time and time again with their characters' kits, but rather, maybe it should be that the paths don't matter. Maybe the character paths are just there to give us a general idea of what they are decent at, but beyond that are just meant to be ignored. After all, their playable paths don't even follow the lore paths normally, so certainly their gameplay doesn't have to rigidly align with its own description either, right? Games offer classifications so commonly that often we form harder rules for the characters than the game itself does. All we have to do is examine how we treat games with no classifications. I mean, look at Genshin. No character in that game has a classification beyond their element, and yet we just examine kits themselves to determine whether a character is sustain, or sub DPS, or DPS, or whatever. We don't need to be told. But because there's no classifications in that game, players also feel free to experiment. Barbara is great at healing, but some guy out there is playing normal attack Barbara because in their mind, the game didn't say she's just a support, you know? So that's it, yeah, the takeaway. Just ignore the path labels. Judge more on the merit of the kit. Even if you have Fushuan and Aventurine, don't necessarily write off the next preservation unit just because you feel your shielding is adequate. Sure, when the drip marketing does hit, acknowledge their path. But immediately after, forget you ever saw it, because the chances are there's going to be way more to it than what's written on the tin. Or at least that's how I'm gonna start treating the 4 non-DPS paths anyway. Or is that 3 non-DPS paths? What the heck, Nihility?